an ongoing debate in the Confucian tradition is the choice between two basic values. On the one hand, humanity, on the other, propriety or ritual. Which is more central? Whether an inner sense of direction about one's moral objectives or moral orientation is more important than meeting the objective standards of behavior. One with emphasis, on the surface at least, on the inner side of the process of learning to be human. The other with emphasis on the behavioral pattern, the outer realm, which can be easily observed. But if you read the Analects, it seems quite clear that the idea of humanity, which is both a central idea and has the kind of breadth of meaning that we need to understand. If we want to understand Confucian ethics, the most basic value in the Confucian tradition ought to be the idea of ren, which is variously rendered as benevolence, goodness, human-heartedness, and we simply rendered here as humanity. Out of the 499 chapters, references to humanity can be counted as many as 58, and as some scholars have noted, more than 100 times, 105 times, Confucius referred to this particular idea. So this talk is try to give you a sense of what humanity really means. When I use humanity, of course, this is the rendering of either the Romanized character J-E-N or the pinyin R-E-N, ren. The character is written very simply as this, which sometimes referred to as the human with a radical tu. So some people even propose that the word humanity should be translated as co-humanity. It is not possible simply to understand a person as an isolated individual. But that is still a debatable point. It can either be a particular virtue or a general virtue. A particular virtue is it's a virtue that can be understood in terms of a constellation of other virtues. Or it can be a general virtue that permeates the whole spectrum of virtue ideas, so it is all pervasive. I think we should take ren in both senses. On the one hand, Confucius once made the remark that is humanity or ren far away? As soon as I want it, there it is right by me. So it's easy. Whenever I want it, it is with me. So willing necessarily entails getting it. So this notion about ren, about humanity, is to say it's very easy. If we want it, we get it. And also we know in the Analects, Confucius never described himself as ren, as a man of humanity. The only person that he described as someone who came close to it was one of his best disciples. He said he was able to do it for 3 months. Most of the other people probably managed to do it in a month or a day. Very few people qualify to be called humanity, a person who demonstrates humanity. Now here I want you to understand the paradox. The paradox requires a minimum appreciation, a minimum requirement on the one hand, and the maximum realization. So the idea of ren, the idea of humanity, is both a minimum requirement to be human and also the maximum realization to be the most fully developed human. So the language then becomes clear. As a minimum requirement, we cannot afford not to be. As a maximum realization, no matter how hard we try, there's always room for improvement. We can never fully realize it. As a kind of particular virtue, as a virtue among other virtues, for example, the statement, set your will on the way. You should set your will on the way of learning to be human. Have a firm grasp on virtue. The term virtue here, 德, which means the kind of good ideas or good habits that have been already internalized. Rely on humanity, and then find recreation in the arts. So set your will on the way, have a firm grasp on virtue, rely on humanity, find recreations in the arts. Humanity, certainly one of those virtues, one of those ideas that you should take into consideration. When a man's knowledge is sufficient for him to attain a position or attain leadership, but his humanity is not sufficient for him to hold it. Even if he get it, eventually he will lose it. When his knowledge is sufficient for him to attain the position or the leadership, and his humanity is sufficient for him to hold it, if he does not approach people with dignity, the people will not respect him. If his knowledge is sufficient for him to attain it, his humanity is sufficient for him to hold it, and he approaches the people with dignity, yet does not influence them with the principle of propriety, with rituals, it is still not good. So the humanity in this sense is the kind of ambiance, the kind of quality that will help you to hold on to a position your knowledge has helped you to obtain. But that's it. It requires your approaching the people with dignity and also try to apply the principle of propriety. So humanity in this sense, well, I have to confess that even with this, I've been struggling with this for a long time. Even after this lecture, still, what is humanity? Don't ask me that question for definition. Because the Confucian mode of thinking is not based upon definition. It's based upon a taste and appreciation and analytical appreciation of how it links to many other things. So you want to single that out to find a definition, whether it means good, means humane, means human-heartedness. The focused investigation itself may provide a certain kind of narrow-mindedness. Then you will not be able to appreciate how the term is used in a more dynamic, transformative way. So don't worry about definitions. What you need to worry about is what we call the ring of values or the ring of virtues, how they're interconnected. In what sense one defines the other, and how you reappreciate it in terms of your own experience. It is analytical. There is inner logic. There is a sense of sequence. But don't approach it from the very beginning with a definitional approach. And also, keep in mind, even the word is translated as humanity. Sometimes it's better to be translated as goodness. Simon Leys has done it within his text. Sometimes it's probably more appropriate to use the word benevolent. Sometimes simply human-heartedness or humaneness. And you need to use all the English terms that at your disposal to try to fix it. And it's like a changing target. You cannot fix it very easily, but the more you try to relate yourself with these kind of ideas, the more you will be able to acquire a taste. It's much more important for you to acquire a taste for what that is than to be cognitively, in the very beginning, to be precise about what this really is. I think the virtue of that should become clear later. So there's no question about the fact, one thing we can be sure, that to become a humane person, to become a person of humanity, is one of the highest ideals, and also the very basic requirement of Confucian ethics. And it is in this sense, all the discourses on Confucian ethics are somehow related to the question of humanity. That's the reason I first want to use a rather mechanistic way. You want to list all the major virtues in the Confucian tradition. Humanity is never absent. This is a clear demonstration. It is there. It is pervasive, and we need to understand it. We need to recognize it. Sometimes Confucius gave a very simple answer. What is humanity? Humanity is to love people. What is wisdom? Wisdom is to know people. So the sense of care, sense of love, certainly benevolent, certainly an integral part of that. And it has often been paired with other major Confucian values, such as propriety, rightness, or wisdom. And sometimes humanity is grouped together with two other virtues, wisdom and courage, as the three great Confucian virtues. Confucius once said, the way of a superior person is threefold, but I have not been able to attain it. I failed in all these three areas. The man of wisdom has no perplexities. The brilliant mind is able to see through things in such clarity, the person knows exactly what to do. I'm not able to do it. The man of humanity has no worry. A person who is humane is above worrying about his or her own self-interest. A much broader vision about humanity. I'm not able to do it. A man of courage has no fear. I'm not able to do it. So courage, wisdom, and humanity are also sometimes grouped together. When we move on to Mencius, Mencius made it very clear the four beginnings, the four most basic values in the Confucian teaching are humanity, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. Courage is no longer there, but courage can come in different guises or different fashions. Now, most people now agree that the five most basic values in the Confucian tradition, if you want to remember five virtues in the Confucian tradition, they are simply humanity, rightness, propriety, wisdom, and trust. This has been very widely accepted in the last 2,000 years as the five basic Confucian virtues. Then, what is humanity as a virtue? First of all, it may not be far-fetched to simply describe the idea of humanity as understood by Confucius as a certain kind of life force, dynamism, a living person. A living person exhibits the quality of being humane, just being a living person. A dead person is devoid of humanity in that sense. A person who's so insensitized, become paralyzed in terms of sensitivity, would be considered devoid of some quality of humanity. Vital force, vitality. To study extensively, to be steadfast in one's purpose, to inquire earnestly, and to reflect on what is at hand. Humanity consists in these. One way of looking at it, a person with dynamism, with vitality, earnestness in learning, steadfastness of purpose, and it will be able to inquire any subject earnestly and reflect. The last thing is particularly interesting, reflect upon things at hand, immediately. Not indulge in simply abstract thinking, speculative thought, but to be very grounded, rooted in one's particular situation, and will be able to reflect upon what is near at hand. Now, many later Confucians actually characterize their own work as reflections on things at hand, reflections on things immediate. For example, you live in the dorm, you take courses, you compile your study card, you talk to your friends, you communicate with your family members. All these things are considered, if you reflect on them, this is where humanity really lies. It is embodied, it is embedded, it is not an abstract idea. When it comes to the practice of humanity, one should not defer even to one's teacher. There's no one else has more authority on my understanding of my humanity. I alone of course, as a set of relationships, is responsible. So as a life force, you can actually imagine humanity in terms of, in the health sciences, that a healthy person is a person has vitality, has vitality, the person is wholesome. You may become sick, but then you'll bounce back. It's more important to have the vital energy and maintain a healthy body than to avoid sickness. You may be sick all the time, but if your vitality, your basic health is great, you'll bounce back. You've never been sick, but the energy is very low. Once you become sick, it could turn out to be fatal. So the notion about the energy, the life force, the certain kind of spiritual force that will sustain you as a living person, that's related to Ren. It has broad ethical implications. But it is also sensitivity. The person who is strong, physically, mentally strong, is not necessarily a person who can impose his views and ideas upon others. A person is strong precisely because the person is also sensitive. If a person is not humane, what has he to do with rites or ceremonies? If he's not humane, what has he to do with music? What does that mean? Meaning that rites, rituals, the proper way of doing things, and even music, all these can only be acquired as a taste for someone who's sensitive as a human being. If that sensitivity is no longer there, then ritual becomes simply ceremony. Music simply becomes sound with no actual transformative power at all. Now, Confucius once said, be respectful in private life. Be reverent in handling affairs, and be loyal in dealing with others. These are the principles of humanity. Again, it means sensitive to yourself, sensitive to the things you do, your daily affairs, and also sensitive to the need of others. And this sensitivity is not a sign of weakness at all. This is a sign of strength, a sign of self-understanding. And therefore, some values that are implicit in humanity, such as courtesy, tolerance, good faith, diligence, and generosity. So once the remark was made, whoever could spread the five practices everywhere in the whole world, implement humanity. So humanity that can be implemented is by courtesy. Courtesy is to accept the other in terms of respect, but also the sense of tolerance, especially for those things that we do not like. Again, a sense of sensitivity. Have the good faith in dealing with others. Diligence is a kind of self-assertion, continue to refine one's own character, and a sense of generosity. Courtesy wards off insult. Tolerance, in a way, will be able to win all hearts. Good faith inspires the trust of others. Diligence ensures success, and generosity confers authority upon others in the sense we can enjoy the service of others. So humanity in this sense as sensitivity is also invitational. Invite an ever-extending network of people to be in communication with you, because to be humane in this sense is to open to the outside world, not only to other human beings, eventually also to nature and to the arts, to the spiritual forces. But I think even more important, perhaps, is the idea of humanity clearly linked to a sense of an inner strength. In other words, it's an inner strength. It's not something that easily demonstrable. Confucius was very, very un-Greek in this sense. The people with clever words and ingratiating appearance are seldom people of humanity. People who are eloquent may be humane, but the people who have, can use clever words and put too much emphasis on the appearances. Humanity is absent because people with too much emphasis on verbal expression and on appearances, of course we understand it too, could turn out to be shallow. This lack of interiority, lack of inner quality. And in fact, only the people who are considered humane, this is the Confucian argument, that can endure adversity for a long time and will be able to enjoy prosperity for a long time because the person is basically comfortable. The person has inner strength, comfortable with the particular position. It's very difficult for any of us without that humanity, as Confucius understood it, to endure adversity. For a short run, while we're young, we'll not be able to do that. Or to enjoy prosperity without being corrupted by it. Only the person with humanity, in a sense, sustained sense of vitality and also sensitivity, will be able to endure adversity and also enjoy prosperity for a long time. So a person who is strong, resolute, simple, and slow to speak is near humanity. So humanity described in terms of behavior is someone strong, not necessarily macho, resolute, meaning determined, simple, meaning not being complicated. Your life can be extremely complicated, but you have the simple-mindedness to sail through that complexity. Slow to speak is very interesting because more self-reflective. But when I ask you questions, please raise your hand and speak. This is near humanity in the sense of this close to my idea of what a human person ought to be. So in this sense, he strongly, with a sense of persistency, strongly believes that a profound person never abandons humanity because the inner strength, which means endurance, even for a moment, even for the lapse of a single meal. In moments of haste, he acts according to it. In times of difficulty or confusion, he acts according to it. Here, the idea of humanity almost becomes a kind of goal, becomes an idea that we try to aspire to, and becomes a source of inspiration for our activity. This is what Confucius tried to encourage his students to do. That it's always the highest idea of being human, right? That's humanity. And we, as ordinary human beings, can never be able to reach that, especially when we have so many other things that we worry about. But yet, that ideal, if it is not forgotten, if it is always there, even for the lapse of a single meal, it is not forgotten. And that is the best way to cultivate oneself. And he says, is there anyone who has devoted his strength to humanity for as long as a single day? I've not seen anyone without sufficient strength to do so. So, a recommendation to his students, say, try to live a single day. First, try to live a single day. Every moment of that day inspired by the highest idea of humanity. Sensitivity, endurance, inner strength, inspired by that. Even for the lapse of one moment, we don't forget it. Now, he said he was not able to do it because he was not a humane man. Not that he was not able to do it for a day, because his student Liang Hui was able to do it for 3 months. But most of the people will only be able to do it a week or a month. But even with that, we can say live in the kind of sacred life from the Confucian point. It's sacred life. The life of the highest energy possible that generated highest vitality, highest self-respect, highest respect for all the other people. Just try to do it, if not a day, half a day, or any time. This reminds me, actually, in the Buddhist tradition, for example, a different exercise, a very different exercise, but comparable in spirit. Try to, instead of a day, that's impossible, try to do it in 1 minute when you sit, and try not to think in 1 minute. And very few people can achieve it within the first week. You just sit, and of course your mind wanders. In about 10 seconds, you're thinking about all kinds of things. You have a question? Right. Yeah. Now the question is, since I raised the Buddhist question, it's a legitimate question, that how would a Confucian look at a Buddhist situation? For example, Buddha became enlightened and was able to become so enlightened that all his egoistic desires have been overcome. So a clear demonstration of enlightenment. I think from the Confucian point of view, it's really something and some idea for admiration, for appreciation, for emulation. And the notion that one is able to transcend one's ego, transcend all the imperfections, and become totally embodied in the enlightened Buddha. This is something for great admiration. In fact, great Confucian thinkers all become admirers of this particular event. And you can also say, from the Christian point of view, a person actually became God. The person, in fact, is God incarnate. Therefore, not an ordinary person, just the exemplar. But the Confucian approach, in a sense, is very modest and also realistic. Confucius is not an enlightened Buddha. Confucius is not God incarnate. He's a person. He's an older person, deeply committed to the process of improving humanity from within. So I don't think Confucius ever totally overcome his egoistic desires. Even though he did mention that I was able to free myself from 4 constraints. Too much opinionatedness, too much insistence upon my ego, too much self-centeredness, and too much notion of me or I. So there are indications he tried very hard to overcome all these egoistic forces. But since he believed that you have to work in the world here and now with other human beings, so the important thing then is not to say what I have, what I achieved is so distinct from any other people. The only way they can become what they ought to be is to simply emulate my path. Because the message here is that each human being will have to find a way of true self-realization. In a way, this is not at all in conflict with some of the Mahayana Buddhist idea. So then, finally, in terms of this particular section, as a virtue, it is a creatively transformative virtue. You can imagine Ren, you can try to think about Ren as something which is so pervasive. No matter what kind of virtue we talk about in the Confucian tradition, we have to imagine the presence of Ren as a dimension. So it has the transformative power within this ring of virtues. A simple exercise. Cleverness becomes wisdom because of Ren, because of humanity. Simply being smart, being clever is not good enough. You have to be wise. How can you become wise? Not just being clever. Ren is indispensable. You're very brave. But bravery is not good enough. You should have courage, including moral courage. How can you transform your bravery, as a warrior, to become a courageous person with tremendous moral indignation sometimes? Again, humanity is indispensable. You may be self-righteous. Can you become a person who is right to exercise what the Confucians called the appropriateness, rightness? And then you should transform your self-righteousness through the practice of humanity to become right. You may be stubbornly adhere to certain kind of external ritual forms. You do not make mistakes in those areas. But have you really exercised the spirit of propriety in all situations? Then humanity becomes significant. If some of us, literally interpret the legal obligations of someone else, if we exercise Ren, that kind of literal interpretation may be transformed into a new kind of trust. Now some people say, well, Ren, humane, good-hearted person. If I tell him there's someone under the well, will he just automatically go into it? Confucius was not happy with that question. The question is, these people can be easily duped, can be easily fooled. He said, now, look, a person of humanity may make mistakes. A person of humanity may be fooled at a certain time. But he's not stupid. He's not humankind. He's not simply being kind to the extent that he doesn't have any kind of objective, rationalistic criteria. He's a man with tremendous inner strength, a judgment, and yet he's decent. The decency is not because he's not strong. The decency is really based upon his own self-assertion, his self-understanding, his self-knowledge. Maybe I stop here and see you have other questions. Just for a moment. But if you don't have questions, I want to ask you one. You try to think. Maybe you haven't really given a lot of thought to this. If you have to make a choice between two very important values in terms of your own life orientation, right? One is sympathy, the other one is rationality. You may want to think just a moment. I want to simply responses. Which in your mind is more basic for the development of a moral person, of a moral community? Rationality or sympathy? We say both. But now your choice is which one is, in your view, more basic. You have to have rationality, otherwise the societies become chaotic. Or you have to have sympathy, otherwise people cannot. So I want to first show of hands, how many considers rationality more important than sympathy, and how many consider sympathy more important than rationality? It's a simple-minded exercise, but it's revealing. How many say rationality? How many say rationality? How many say sympathy? That's amazing. That's strange, actually. When I first taught this course in 1992, and the question was asked, even before I gave any lectures, maybe you've been so much influenced that you do not think rationally in terms of your self-interest. So in the very beginning, I asked this question, more than 65% to 70% consider rationality more important than sympathy. Right now, okay, we have at least one, why rationality is more important than sympathy. In fact, I think most of the philosophers in the West, with some notable exceptions, would consider rationality as absolutely the basic first principle. The great philosopher of morality in the West, Kant, and say, you really don't have to feel it. There's a very interesting question that he raised about morality. If the owner of a candy bar decides not to cheat the little girl who wants to buy the candy. It's not because he's sympathetic. That's not good enough. He can be moral only when he wants the rule of his activity. For example, that he doesn't want to cheat the little girl, generalized in such a way that every human being should act accordingly. If I cheat the little girl, then if my little girl is being cheated, it's not good enough. The only reason I don't want to cheat the little girl is because that action can be generalized according to a rational principle to everyone. Everyone should act accordingly. Even if I don't feel, sympathy is not very important in that condition, in that situation. But we know how serious sympathy is in the Confucian tradition. If there's no sympathy, then there's no possibility of real moral community. Even if we can calculate rationally very, very well, that calculation, if it is not based upon our actual feeling about what we ought to do, can be manipulative. We can design rules of the game to benefit ourselves. Right now, in the international community, the highest value is national interest. So the countries that are strong and powerful will be able to design all kinds of rules of the game. Eventually, these countries will be beneficiaries. So let's revisit this golden rule or the golden mean stated in the negative. But the more active Confucian contribution to the golden rule. A person of humanity wishing to establish himself, his own character, also establish others, wishing to make himself prominent, also helps others to become prominent. This is what we talked about, a supplementary idea towards the golden rule. Do not do to others. Do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. But there is a statement that Confucius made. To be able to judge others by what is near to ourselves may be called the method of realizing humanity. Humanity can be realized if we are able to judge others by what is near to ourselves. Our self-understanding becomes a criterion, our own feeling. In other words, how do we put ourselves in the shoes of someone else? Or how do we empathetically understand the position of someone else? This is called analogical thinking. This analogical thinking becomes a way of life. It is a way of life because it requires the cultivation of, I may have to move a little bit fast, but I think the idea is we have to go through a cultivation where feeling, close feeling, and ethical behavior, and even spiritual exercise are all linked. In other words, we first ought to be excited by the poetic vision. Human sensuality, the basic feelings, sensuous feelings, all these are positive. But they have to be refined, they have to be disciplined. Otherwise, our freedom will turn out to be disastrous for the community, for the family. So we should be excited by our sensuous feelings, sex, appetite, all these feelings, aroused by music, first aroused by the poetic vision. And we should be excited. And it's much better for someone who is strong, excited, and forging ahead, making all kinds of mistakes, than someone who is very safe, without any energy. Once the mistakes is made, it becomes very, very grave. But that excitement, that sense of vitality will have to be disciplined through self-discipline. I have all kinds of fanciful ideas, but most of the fanciful ideas, I do not act upon them through certain kind of discipline. Elimination of this, not because I don't have them, I have them, but I have to make choices. I have to eliminate a large body of them, to my great regret. But I need that particular discipline. And only through that discipline will I be able eventually to harmonize myself. So this humanity as embodied, an embodied care or an embodied love is not only a sympathetic way of life, but also it has to go through, like all of us, a sequence of learning. We need to be excited by poetry, by all these things. We will discipline ourselves with rituals, and we harmonize ourselves with music. And it is in this sense, most Confucians believe that being inspired and then disciplined, then harmonized, is the way to generate tremendous dynamism as vitality and to make us be more sensitive towards others and to develop inner strength. So the answer, Confucius' answer to all his disciples when they ask the question about humanity variously, some to say, well, love others, some to say discipline yourself, some to say don't speak too fast, some to say please express yourself in a proper way, to serve others, to be filial, all kinds of different answers. But the answer to his best disciple, Yan Hui, was a very interesting answer. That is the reason why the ongoing debate, whether Confucius really considered humanity as inner strength, as inner quality is as important as the ritual or proper way of doing things as important. This is the answer. Yan Hui asked about humanity. Confucius said, to master yourself and return to propriety is humanity. You master yourself through self-discipline, through cultivation. But then you return to propriety. Propriety is the proper way of doing things. Next week, we're going to read a fantastic book, a very small one. It's by Fingeret. And the title of the book, there's a character, Li, which means propriety, or civility, or ritual. And that's another very important cardinal virtue in Confucian thought. If a person can, for one day, master himself and return to propriety, all under heaven will return to propriety. All under heaven will return to humanity. This is often an extremely mysterious statement. If a person can for one day master himself and return to propriety, all under heaven will return to humanity. Now, some readers say, well, this person must be the ruler. This person must be the sage king. Only the sage king is returning to propriety. All the others, through imitation, will be able to do that. But I don't want to simply suggest the person is the sage king. I want to suggest the person is every one of us. If a person, any one of us, returns to propriety, all under heaven, if a person masters himself or herself and returns to propriety, all under heaven will return to humanity. We may want to struggle with that particular understanding sometime. To practice humanity depends on oneself. It doesn't depend upon anyone else. So it totally upon oneself. Then Yan Hui asked, could you give me the detail? You gave us a general principle. Give us the detail. This is what Confucius said. Do not look at what is contrary to propriety. Do not listen to what is contrary to propriety. Do not speak what is contrary to propriety. Do not make any movement which is contrary to propriety. Now, if that's the case, is it true in the Confucian teaching that to act properly, according to the social convention, the social norm of the time, becomes the only way to practice humanity? Or the practicing humanity involves a creative transformation of the world, including the rituals. Many scholars insisted that for the Confucians to practice humanity, you really have to go to the roots. What are the roots of humanity? Filial piety and brotherly respect. So you have to be filial, you have to be respectful to the elders. This is how you become humane. And you have to move things close to you and gradually expanding outward. And it is in this sense too, to the end, I hope I have 1 minute to argue against that position, but it is in this sense too that the 5 relationships are also considered absolutely critical for the practicing of humanity. The parent-child relationship is governed by the feeling of affection. The ruler-minister by idea of rightness. Siblings in terms of orderliness. Husband and wife, division of labor. Friends, trust. Why the family? Why the 5 relationships? Gender, age, status, all involved in this process. Each relationship is unique. For many of us, maybe some of the relationships are not as important as others. But each relationship is unique. The practice of humanity from within to the without, from the near to far, requires a sense of our situatedness. Therefore, how to deal with the people who are the closest to us, our parents, our siblings, your married, your spouse, children, and of course friends, becomes critical. And each one of them requires mutual adjustment. Only the politicized relationships emphasize the importance of domination and power. The non-politicized, humane approach is a mutual adjustment and mutual exhortation. Now, this is a recommendation. Say, you learn to be human, the highest idea of being human, begin with the arena in which you're familiar with. I will end with a statement by one of Confucius' disciples. Say, a resolute scholar and a person of humanity will never seek to live at the expense of injuring humanity. He would rather sacrifice his life in order to realize humanity. So humanity requires certain idea of self-sacrifice. Therefore, a true Confucian must be great and strong. Great in terms of broad vision, strong in terms of inner strength. His burden is heavy and his course is long. He has taken humanity to be his own burden. Actually, humanity, you realize your own humanity. Is that not heavy? Only with death does the whole course or this travel stop. Is that not long? So try to think in terms of this notion, whether it's a kind of an idealistic notion that is totally beyond us, or actually we can, if we want, to use this idea as a guide at least for one day.